Welcome to another video from explainingcomputers.com. This time we're going to look at lightweight Linux distros that can bring new life to older computers. But what, you may reasonably ask, do I mean by an older computer? Well, here we're going to focus on hardware that's more than 10 years old. And even more specifically, we're going to look at running Linux on older computers in three specific categories, which are 64-bit older computers with relatively powerful CPUs and 4GB of RAM or more. Next, we'll look at 64-bit computers with less powerful CPUs and or less than 4GB of RAM. And finally, very old computers with 32-bit processors. So let's go and get started. Right, here we have our first test computer, which is a mini ITX system in the custom case that I built on the channel a few weeks ago. Its processor, under here, is a 4th generation Intel Core i3 4330T, which was launched in late 2013, and so is over 12 years old. The 4330T is dual core with a base frequency of 3 GHz, and I ran it for many years with 8 GB of RAM. However, for our tests I removed one of its DDR3 memory modules, here it is, and so here we're testing a system with a 12-year-old Core i3 with 4 GB of memory. If we go across to the desktop, the first Linux distro I've installed is Lubuntu 2404, which runs perfectly happily. And indeed it should, as the recommended minimum system requirements for desktop Lubuntu are a dual-core 2 GHz processor with 4 GB of RAM and 25 GB of drive space for a full install. Linux Mint, Zorin OS and most other mainstream distros will also run well on any dual-core 4 GB system that's over 10 years old. So, on our first category of older hardware, we've no actual requirement to seek out a lightweight distro, although we're going to do so. However, just before we do, let's open the system monitor. There it is, so we can see how much memory is being used, and it is about 1.4 GB, which is about 36% of the 4 GB available. Next, let's open up LibreOffice Writer. Here we go, and also we'll bring in a recent document. There we are, a test document, and I'm also going to open up the Firefox web browser, which I've set to preload 3 web pages, which are the Explaining Computers index page, a very lightweight page, but also a YouTube page, which is, as we know, much heavier, and also an Amazon page, also quite a heavy page, and so we're now running 3 web pages, and also we're running LibreOffice Writer with a test document. So if we go back to the system monitor, we can see we're now using about 2.4 GB of memory, or about 61% of the 4 GB available. Today, I'm often told that 4 GB computers are no longer usable, and that clearly isn't true. It is certainly possible to run Ubuntu very successfully on a 4 GB system of this specification. So, with this baseline established here in Ubuntu, let's try the first of our lightweight distros. And here we are on the same computer running Lubuntu 2404. This is based on Ubuntu, but has a lighter weight LXQT desktop. Lubuntu 2404 requires a 1 GHz processor and an absolute minimum of 1 GB of RAM, although 2 GB is recommended. And Lubuntu needs up to 20 GB of drive space. Given these specifications, Lubuntu runs very well on our i3 4330T 4 GB system. Some users may find the LXQT desktop a bit minimal. I personally quite like it, lots of things are pre-installed, and it's nice and responsive and runs well on older hardware. I can't here run up the system monitor to show you memory usage because it's not pre-installed, and in this video we'll be comparing clean installs of the distros we're looking at, but if we go to System Tools and HTOP, which is pre-installed, we can see we're using, 785 megabytes of memory, running nothing other than the program that's showing us how much memory we're using, which is almost half what we were using over in Ubuntu. And we do the same thing we did in Ubuntu. If we go and run up LibreOffice Writer and bring in our test file like that, there it is, and also run up Firefox to load in our 3 web pages explaining computers and the YouTube page and also the Amazon page. There they are. If we now go back to HTOP, we can see we're now using just over 1.7 gigabytes of memory on our 4 gigabyte system. So once again, we're in a better position compared to Ubuntu. And indeed, Lubuntu is one of my 3 recommendations for a lightweight Linux distro to run on our first older hardware category. Meanwhile, the second is MX Linux. So let's use the magic of filmmaking to transition to that. Specifically, we're now running MX Linux 25.1 with an XFCE desktop. XFCE is a little heavier than the LXQT desktop we were just running in Lubuntu, and indeed MX Linux is often referred to as a mid-weight distro. But this still means it runs very well indeed on our first category of older hardware. Like Lubuntu, MX Linux requires a 1 GHz processor and a minimum of 1 GB of RAM, with 2 GB recommended and up to 20 GB of storage space. MX Linux is based on Debian, and as we can see if we go to the download page on its website, is available with a number of desktop and other options. And for older hardware, the first option with an XFCE desktop is recommended, and specifically the ISO you can download from this first link. So let's close the web browser and check out memory use. There is an indicator here on the screen for those with extremely good eyes, but let's also go down to the menu and run up an application to show us memory being used. And as in Lubuntu, we don't have the graphical system monitor pre-installed, but we do have HTOP, so let's use HTOP to show us memory use. And what can we see? About 665, 652, 660, something like that, megabytes of memory being used, which is very good, slightly better than we saw in Lubuntu and massively different to what we saw in Ubuntu. And as previously, we'll run up some software and just see what happens when we've done that. And I know we're likely to see roughly the same memory use in each system. About a gigabyte of memory is going to be used running LibreOffice Writer with our test document and our 3 web pages, but it will vary a bit when we start to use different web browsers in some of the lighter distros we'll see a bit later on. And also I want you to see how responsive a system is loading these things up. That obviously came up very easily, as it did in the previous distros. And again, I think we'll see no problems at all with Firefox loading in the Explaining Computers web page, but also these 2 heavier web pages, the YouTube page and the Amazon page. And that won't be the case necessarily when we are running some much more lightweight distros on much less powerful hardware fairly soon. So let's go back to System and HTOP. And we're now using about, 1.62 gigabytes, something like that. Lastly on this hardware, let's install a lightweight distro actually called Linux Lite. And specifically, we're now running Linux Lite 7.8. This is again based on Debian with an XFCE desktop and is designed to be as familiar as possible to Windows users who are new to Linux. And indeed, we can even see My Computer here in the menu, and indeed the menu is what I would consider to be the right way round compared to what we just saw in MX Linux. If we look on the Linux Lite website, we find it lists a requirement for a 1.5 GHz processor, 4 GB of memory and 40 GB of drive space. However, it should be possible to run Linux Lite in a lot less memory than this. So let's close the browser and find out how light Linux Lite really is. And here in the menu under System we do have the system monitor. Very fancy it is here in Linux Lite, and we can look under RAM, where as we can see we're using, it's bounding around and about 923, something like that, 923 I think megabytes being used when we're just running the system monitor, which is more than we saw under Lubuntu or MX Linux, but again less than under Ubuntu. And as previously, we'll run up an application load just to show you how things are working on this system. Here under Office it says Word Processor, but guess what? It's LibreOffice Writer What do we think it was going to be? WordPerfect 5.1? We could not be so lucky, could we? Anyway, let's bring in our test document. There it is, all working fine. The system is extremely responsive, and we'll now also run up our browser, which here is the Chromium browser, which will bring in our test pages as we've seen previously. There they are, like that and like that. And because we're here in Chrome, we can actually see how much memory is being used by these individual tabs. 25 megabytes for Explaining Computers index page, 201 for the YouTube page, and about 70 megabytes for the Amazon page. And if we now just go back to, I can out tab content, there we are, we can go back to how much RAM is being used. It's gone up to about 1.9, maybe 1.8 gigabytes. And I would note here that Linux Lite does feel very responsive, even compared to Lubuntu or MX Linux. I can't quite put my finger on why, but it does. It's difficult to get this across in the video, but it is using a bit more memory. Right, let's move on to running Linux on older computers, which are still 64-bit, but which have a less powerful processor and or less than 4 gigabytes of memory. And if we take a look inside our test computer, we can see it's been transformed into such a system based on an embedded Mini ITX Atom board. Specifically, this system is based on an Atom D525, here passively called, as we can see, and the D525 was launched in June 2010 and so is 15 years old. The D525 is also dual core, it runs at 1.8 GHz, and here it's paired with 2 GB of RAM. And before anybody says so, I don't have an I/O shield fitted here. Why? Because it's gone on holiday, or in other words, I don't know where it is. Anyway, let me show you what kind of Linux distro we can run on this system. If we go over to the desktop, I've first installed MX Linux. Because of the 3 distros we've looked at so far, it offers the most free memory to run applications. Just to note, if things look slightly fuzzy, we're now running hardware that only has a VGA connector for video output, and so we're now seeing a 1080p desktop recorded via an analog output. Also note, if you decide to give an old computer new life running Linux, on first boot you may run into problems like this, which are caused by the motherboard CMOS battery being dead. And although we can get through this by repeatedly pressing keys, there we go, the problem can be fixed by fitting a new motherboard battery, which is usually a CR2032 cell. Back on the desktop, MX Linux is running reasonably well, and if we look in System, we can bring up HTOP, and we can see, as previously, it's using, what is it, about 650 there, 645, 634, 630, maybe a little bit less amount of memory. It keeps bounding around, doesn't it? But it's using just over 600 megabytes of memory off the 2 gigabytes available. So let's try to run up the things we were running up in our previous tests, and this is where things get a little bit different, and very much this is an example of how things are actually functioning. You'll see things are less responsive, we've got less memory, and obviously it's just a less powerful computer. It'll get there in the end. There we are, it's done that. Let's bring in our test document, and LibreOffice Writer is certainly usable on this system, but it's more sluggish than we saw on the previous computer. When you start running Linux on much older computers, you really have to temper your expectations, but this certainly works. So let's now run up the Firefox web browser, and here I've set it to preload the Explaining Computers index page, but nothing else because it is getting a bit sluggish. But that page comes in fact quite well. It was trying to spite me, wasn't it? And let's next load in the Amazon page, and I know it's linked down there. Let's open that in a new tab. Here we go, loading in an Amazon storefront, which has come in without any real issues. But we're now going to go for the YouTube page, which I will type in manually. There we go. And this will start to give it a few issues, I think. Certainly that's my previous experience. That's why I haven't brought it up in one go. As you can see, things are taking a little time. It's not the speed of the internet connection, it's the speed of the system actually processing all the data from a heavier web page, which is coming in like that. And almost got there. This is not the page we were looking at before, which is, oh dear, it's fallen over. And that's the problem I've been having. I've not managed to get a YouTube page to open. Let's log it again. And that's the situation we're at running MX Linux on this 15-year-old 2GB computer. And I have tried running both Lubuntu and Linux Lite on this configuration, and they also have a few problems. MX Linux does give the best performance. So this all suggests we need an even lighter Linux distro, so let's use the magic of filmmaking and go across to that. And here we are running Q4OS, which is a very lean Linux distro indeed. Q4OS is a game based on Debian, and as we can see if we look at the download page on its website, it's available with either a KDE Plasma or the very lightweight Trinity desktop. And here we're running the Trinity version, which, as we can see if we scroll down, only requires a 500 MHz CPU, 512 MB of RAM and 6 GB of storage space. It's also worth noting that in the installer there are 4 software options, starting with one that includes a web browser and Office suite, as well as basic, live and pure versions. Although on first boot we're asked about this again, where I again selected for a full software install to provide everyday desktop PC functionality. And as we can see if we close down the browser and look at the desktop, there's a good range of things pre-installed. We do have now LibreOffice, we've got VLC Media Player, we've got the Chromium browser, and I can report that Q4OS seems to be very stable. It works very nicely indeed. So let's go to the menu and find something to show us how much memory is being used. We look at applications, programs, accessories, and down the bottom here is system, and we've got here what they call their process viewer, which is HTOP, as it says just below. And as this shows us, we're using just over 450 megabytes of memory with just HTOP running. So significantly less we've seen in any other operating systems so far. So let's close this down and run some of the tests we've done previously, see how far we can get. Let's again go back to applications, programs, and Office down there. I do like this desktop. It's very lightweight, but it seems to work very well indeed. And anyway, let's just run up word processor, which is obviously LibreOffice Writer. Here it comes in. A little bit sluggish. This is a hardware issue, not really a software issue, but it's perfectly usable. Seems to be stable. And we'll just bring in test document, which will come in. Takes a minute to have a think. It's having a think. Shall we encourage it? There it is. That's good. So that clearly works. And we'll try and run that with a web browser with some test pages as well. And talking of web browsers, we've actually got 2 installed now, one of which is called Conqueror. This is always installed in this operating system. We'll just bring it up to show you what the Q4OS website looks like in this browser. It's a very fast, very lightweight browser, but it doesn't render everything perfectly. If I try and scale this up, for example, it really messes up things a bit. So the Q4OS website looks better in Chromium, as we just saw. Anyway, let's now launch the Chromium web browser, which is set to load our 3 test pages as we've seen previously, which wouldn't all work in MX Linux. It does work here in Q4OS. It's loaded explaining computers. It'll be taking a bit of time to bring in the YouTube page, but I think it's going to work. I shouldn't say that'll crash now, won't it? But I've tried this several times and it has worked. I think it's going to work. I think it's done the Amazon page. It's having a think about that. I'm being impatient on it. There we are. The Amazon page is loaded in, no problems at all. And is it going to bring in the YouTube page? Something in which crash things on MX Linux on this hardware, but no, that seems to be working as well. And you might be wondering, can you actually play a YouTube video on hardware of this capability? Well, that's a good thing to wonder. And before we try, we'll close down the tabs we aren't actually using. We'll give the machine a fair chance, give it the maximum resources available for playing back a video. We'll close down everything else that's running other than YouTube, and we'll now go to my standard test video, the good old ducks, and we will try and full screen that. Probably more for us, but we'll have a go. And remember, this is not really a test of Q4OS. This is a test of what you can do on this level of hardware. 15-year-old computer. We're in 360p here, and if we bring up stats for nerds, there we are, good old nerdy stats. We're dropping frames all over the place, aren't we? Which is probably what the ducks are trying to pick up and eat, isn't it? But anyway, I think we're really hitting the point here where you can start to run desktop operating systems and Linux distro on hardware of this specification and do certain things with it, web processing, basic web browsing, etc. But you're not going to do much media stuff, and this is simply because this hardware was never designed to do that. Nevertheless, I am very impressed indeed with Q4OS. Finally, let's turn to running Linux on computers that have a 32-bit processor, such as this EPC 901 from 2008. This has got a single-core 1.6 GHz Intel Atom N270 CPU along with 1 GB of RAM. Before we boot it up and run a distro, it's worth noting that Linux support for 32-bit hardware is declining rapidly, with kernel support now maintenance only. Very significantly, Debian 13 does not support 32-bit processors, which matters as many other distros are based on Debian. And support for Debian 12 LTS ends on June the 30th, 2028, which will mark the end of a lot of 32-bit Linux support. Distros that still offer a 32-bit version include OpenSUSE, Slackware, AntiX, the Puppy Linux family, and Q4OS. And here we're going to take a look at the 32-bit version of AntiX. However, it's important to note that running desktop Linux on 32-bit computers, particularly low-power 32-bit computers like the one we've got here, is not going to deliver amazing results because the hardware is often not capable of doing things like browsing modern web content, regardless of what operating system is installed. This said, let's go across to the desktop for AntiX Linux 23.2. Here we are, and apologies for the big jump, the big transition there between the camera shot of the system and the actual capture. I've had a lot of messing around to do to make this work, and AntiX Linux 23.2 is based on Debian 12, and it's running quite nicely on this system. And if we look down here, we can see the amount of RAM being used, currently exactly 100 megabytes of the 1 GB available. This is impressive, isn't it, compared to anything else? We've seen a massive reduction in the amount of RAM being used. If we go to the menu, let's see if we can bring up an Office application. We should have here, I think, LibreOffice Writer. There it is. We've been seeing it on so many different desktops and different bits of hardware in this video. It'll take a while to come up here. In some ways, this is not a really fair test because you could have an old piece of 32-bit hardware with quite a powerful processor, which we haven't got here, but it's still, we're having a little see how things work, aren't we? I like experimenting with older computers, but really we're now into experimental territory rather than anything that's going to be practically useful for most people, as it was earlier on in the video. Anyway, I'm wishing as this system brings things in, and hopefully we can find a recent document, which is our test document. Will it come in? Oh, I think so. Give it a second. Will it on? Come on, document, you can do it. There we are, look, we've got our test document on this system. And I'll just minimize that. We can see it's taken us up to what, 225, 212 megabytes used, something like that. Although I think we won't actually keep it going because that probably would be cruel. So let's just go back to LibreOffice Writer and close it down before we try to run a web browser. There we are. And let's now run a web browser. Lots of things pre-installed here, aren't they? Got all sorts of software. And there we are. Let's run up the web browser. And I'm going insane, aren't I? You probably noticed that. I've had fun making this video, getting all these old computers working. And anyway, I think we're going into Firefox here. Cross your fingers, we're going to be doing that. We can see our memory use is starting to climb. Something must be happening. The poor little computer's fan is going wild. I don't know if you can hear that in the background, but hopefully in a second we're going to get to a web browser. I used to love using this EPC. There's so much writing on this little computer years and years ago, and so much web browsing. But then the web was not quite as heavy as it is today. But anyway, we've arrived in the web browser, and we will close that down and hopefully it'll load in explainingcomputers.com. It has! It's doing it quite slowly. No Firefox, go away. There we are. And let's see if we can get to an Amazon page. I think it's probably going to be a little bit of a push on this hardware, but we will have a go, and it may get there eventually, hadn't it? I think we're proving the point, really. An EPC from 18 years ago is not an ideal computer to be doing modern things on, but you can still find a lightweight Linux distro that will run on the system. Here we have a summary of the lightweight Linux distros we've run in this video, all of which can bring new life to older hardware. And this has to be a very good thing indeed. And if a computer is less than 10 years old and it's got 4 GB of RAM or more and a reasonably powerful processor, such as an Intel i3 or an early AMD Ryzen, then it should be able to run any mainstream Linux distro. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.